There's nothing worse than explaining a joke, but maybe it's slightly less cringe to explain laughter. And a French bloke called Henri Bergson in the 1920s explained a very specific way in which we can make someone laugh. On the surface, it doesn't really feel like a very significant philosophical subject, but Bergson felt there was something underneath laughter, which tells us how we as humans function amongst each other and how we create groups. But among the philosophers at that time, Bergson was probably one of the few who even attempted to take on a topic like this. He would become known for being very interested in experience as knowledge, or to put it another way, he felt maybe we had lost something in overlooking what experience represented about reality in comparison to external, mathematical, and rational understandings of reality. It would be this approach that would gain him some popularity to the point that he often did public speaking events to packed out audiences, consisting of an unusual number of women for the time who were particularly drawn to his slightly more poetic style of philosophy. Bergson even has the honor of creating the first known traffic jam in Broadway, New York, because people were so excited to see him speak when he visited America. And it would be that poetic style working alongside his experienced-focused approach that allowed him to use practical examples as a form of experience to build up what was provoking laughter itself, something which couldn't really be reduced down to a set of numbers and digits. In a way, Bergson's writing on comedy worked because he wasn't explaining the joke, but he allowed the joke to explain itself. And now we live in a time where comedy seems to have re-emerged as a philosophically and politically charged tool by either politicians or comedians themselves. And I actually think understanding Bergson's take on laughter might actually help us understand our own times a little bit more. So let's get into Bergson's laughter.
I got it!
We have to start by really thinking about what provokes the experience of laughter to get to understanding comedy itself. Bergson points out how laughter is this human activity, not seen in a really complex manner in most animals, which also seems to generally come about as a social response. You might find something funny on your own, but you're more likely to laugh in a group. But there is something a little strange about the process of laughing in that group. We could assume that it's an emotional experience, but Bergson disagrees. He views laughter as actually bringing about a certain absence of feeling, rather than it being an outpouring of feeling. Which sounds a bit weird, but we can see what Bergson means in the classic banana peel gag. If we were empathetic and felt the appropriate emotions to this situation, we would feel the other person's pain and be sympathetic towards their plight. But instead, we distance ourselves from those emotions and only see the accidental activity as illogical, with pure logic being the opposite of pure emotion. And Bergson further points out that this is the split in comedy and drama as well. In the drama, someone gets shot and you feel for that person. In comedy, someone gets shot and you laugh at them. But that doesn't make laughter a lonely experience necessarily for the person laughing, because you experience that laughter as part of a group. You might laugh at someone, but you're laughing with the others who are observing that person from a similar perspective as yourself. Laughter is only a lonely experience for the person getting laughed at, who appears outside of the group, who has done something illogical from the group's perspective. You might laugh with your friends at the teacher, but in doing so, you exclude the teacher from your group. They become the joke to your friendship group's laughter. It makes laughter as capable of exclusion as it is of inclusion, which is where Bergson reaches a somewhat controversial claim. This kind of inclusion and exclusion effect that laughter provokes for Bergson is a social response that maintains a group's shared logic. Laughter punishes whoever has committed a social crime as they experience laughter outside of the group, but also bonds the group together in their shared understanding through their shared experience of laughter at the illogical other. But we can look even further at the mechanism which provokes laughter from comedy to understand this experience even better. If laughter is a part of this comedic process, then there ought to be some kind of mechanism which allows for that process to take place. It's like a watch whose effect is to tell you the time, but can only do so through a series of mechanisms which are the cause to the effect. Because anything could be the source of comedy, as any good stand-up comedian would probably say, but to make it funny, you need to provide the source with a comedic process driven by the comedic mechanisms to provoke laughter. That comedic process relies on revealing an illogical circumstance to whatever the joke is, but Bergson suggests it's even more specific than just revealing something illogical. Bergson believed that laughter was the reveal of the natural actually being mechanical, and in this he basically divides the natural as being this ever-changing, unique movement of life. It's this fluid thing that humans find very difficult to reproduce, while the mechanical is the opposite of the natural. It's this fixed, repetitive thing which stays kind of similar. It has a certain rigidity compared to the natural which we see in the world. The mechanical is our attempt to reproduce the natural and us feeling to do so effectively. Now the comic comes about when the mechanical tries to imitate the natural before our eyes, but gets exposed for its lack of fluidity, uniqueness, flexibility that we kind of associate with the natural. Kind of like whenever a robot tries to imitate a human, it's funny when it can't quite seem to imitate our nature. You may ask why that would be particularly funny, but that's where we bring in the complementary concepts of tension and elasticity. Tension is this pressure which builds up in the presence of two or more conflicting forces, while elasticity is the extent of tension that can be handled before the substance breaks. Literally think of a rubber band which you pull apart with your hands. There are two conflicting forces which pull the rubber band apart, creating a tension as it gets harder to pull until the elasticity of the rubber band releases all of the tension in one dramatic, inelastic moment. Comedy works the same way, in that the rigidity of the mechanical comes into tension with the fluidity of the natural, to a point that the inelasticity of the mechanical is exposed in a comedic moment. And this can come about in a lot of situations which Bergson describes. We have actions which might be exposed as being mechanical rather than natural, like, walking without thinking or daydreaming, breaking the tension by falling over, exposing the mechanical walking. But it could also be something like, a monkey mechanically imitating a human. With appearance, there's a lot of examples actually, but one that became pretty famous was Jim Carrey mechanically making a face, which comes outside of the naturally assumed position for the human face, a deviation from natural beauty. Then we have wordplay, which are synonymous with one-liner stand-up comedians like Mitch Hedberg.
Hey, if you can't sleep, count sheep. Don't count endangered animals, you will run out.
Where they take the assumed natural meaning we have with words and expose their mechanical rigidity through their unintended double meanings. And then we have a really interesting one, which is characters, because Bergson points out the way that dramas are named after people, while comedies are generally named after stereotypes. That's because we can create a comedic stereotype due to the mechanical way a stereotype acts, differing from the unique actions of the natural individual who we would empathize with. In each case, there's generally a logical inconsistency between the presentation of the natural being exposed as being actually mechanical in some sense, with the comedy coming in at the point the tension breaks between the two understandings. But Bergson's suggestion on the mechanisms of the comedic process go even further with three elements that kind of increase the effect of the comedic process, where the natural becomes further exposed as the mechanical with each of these effects. The first we have is repetition, where the same thing happens again and again in this mechanical fashion, unlike the kind of uniqueness of the natural, which we don't necessarily assume to kind of repeat itself in that way. And Bergson would say this gets even more comedic in the case of each repetition containing a further increase in tension, allowing for a greater break in elasticity. Secondly, we have inversion, in which the natural rules or actions are inverted in a mechanical manner. Think of a child acting like an adult.
So then I says to Mabel, I says,
Hi, kids.
I'll finish this later. Hi, Dad.
Where's your mother?
Out back. So anyway, I says to Mabel, I says,
In which the role that we assume for a child is inverted to them acting older than they should. Finally, and this one sounds a little bit more complicated, but you actually see it all the time in like sitcoms, it's the reciprocal interference of series. This is where a situation or action becomes connected to two independent series of events, which allows them to be interpreted in two different meanings. And you can think of this like with a sitcom where a guy is dating two girls at the same time. Each of his actions are understood differently by each girl. This way of looking at comedy as this building up of tension where the mechanical breaks the elasticity of a natural appearance can be a strange way of thinking about the experience of comedy, but even Bergson admits briefly that this is not necessarily the limits of comedy or what might provoke laughter, but it does cover a good amount of ground and does get a good understanding of something in a lot of the comedic process. But I would like to tweak it slightly just to present Bergson's idea in maybe an interesting way that might help us in our current understanding of comedy. So first off, I like that Bergson viewed laughter with this social function, suggesting that comedy has this interaction with the subjective meaning to a group. You know, jokes told within groups, building up a kind of shared understanding between the group's natural assumptions, which we're all familiar with in like small friend groups, where a new person tries to join in but doesn't get the jokes that the group already has and their shared understanding. So I think it might be good to look at comedy through a semiotic lens, which basically is just me saying I want to look at how comedy interacts with meaning in a collective language and our subjective experiences. Let's think of comedy as a process where an object is presented to us and we create a certain meaning as a group onto that object, and we end up associating that meaning as being natural to that object as a group. Like we do with most of our understandings of stuff, you know, we kind of just start to assume that they're natural despite most of it being, you know, these mechanical constructions that we share with each other. So that object may look one way to us as a group, but we can easily shift the object's meaning to look another way by pointing out some logical inconsistency present in our shared understanding of the object and potentially create a new meaning or strip back the old meaning. Here we see the tension present in the naturally assumed meaning of the group and exposing that meaning for being mechanical. The elasticity of the first understanding for that object breaks at the point the new meaning or lack of meaning surfaces onto the object. Basically what I'm saying is the mechanics of comedy is actually the same as the mechanics of changing our understandings of an action or a wording or a character, because we are exposing a natural understanding for being mechanical. Comedy can deconstruct meaning from objects, but let me put it in really nerdy terms where, you know, object A goes through a process of group signification. Through that, object A gains a meaning, let's call it meaning 1, and then a joke comes along and deconstructs that meaning, meaning that object A now gets a new meaning, meaning 2, and meaning 2 might be a certain lack of meaning, or it could be, you know, just a wholly new meaning in itself. But what does that mean for our understanding of comedy?
I just got an email from an ex-girlfriend telling me that she has AIDS, and I didn't know how to comfort her. So I just wrote back, I know.
So with this kind of way that we found Bergson to describe comedy, we can make an inference on how comedy changes over time. Due to the experience of laughter being a product of comedy playing on our current understanding of our surroundings, this means comedy changes over time and in different places, just like a group's understanding will change over time and in space. So comedy itself has a certain dialectic, adapting with the cultural settings it finds itself in. The only reliable thing which we can say are inherently comedic throughout time and space for us as humans are those things which are inherent to the human experience, which we can all share the logic of, like a joke about how shitty it is to get old.
We all have that. No one wants to get old. No one wants to die, but we do. So we bullshit ourselves. I started bullshitting myself when I got to my 40s. As soon as I was in my 40s, I'd look in the mirror and I'd say, well, I guess I'm getting older. Older sounds a little better than old, doesn't it? Sounds like it might even last a little longer. Bullshit, I'm getting old. And it's okay, because thanks to our fear of death in this country, I won't have to die. I'll pass away.
Because no matter the language, no matter the time, humans experience aging. You're part of the group. And this dialectical change in comedy is actually talked about a lot right now and over the last couple decades, generally with the phrase, you can never make that movie today. The statement suggests the person knows the times have changed, but they're mourning the loss of that comedic era. It's basically comic nostalgia. For them, the period of comedy which just passed means something different for them than it does for the new generation, which has a new understanding. It attaches to these old comedies, which they don't experience in their original settings. Think of a joke about answering machines.
Believe it or not, George isn't at home. Please leave a message at the beep. I must be out before I pick up the phone. Where could I be? Believe it or not, I'm not home.
George, pick up. I know you're screening for Allison.
Hey.
At one time, it was funny because we were all part of the group understanding of the joke on contemporary technology. It was relatable, and the mechanical nature came about from the shared experience of how the technology might be irregularly used, or how that technology might make us act outside of the norm sometimes. But now we would watch the same joke about the obsolete answering machine as outside of the original group, but inside a new group, which doesn't find the joke relatable, but finds the joke ridiculous. Because we now can laugh at the idea of the peculiar experience of the mechanical limitations which came about because of the old technology that we no longer experience, like even needing an answering machine at all whenever you have a mobile phone. You once laughed with the joke, but now you laugh at the joke. But we can see this happen with social understandings as well. For example, I saw recently a video where a set of gay men watched the 2000s Adam Sandler movie, I Now Pronounce You Chuck and Larry, about two straight men who enter into a gay relationship for some legal loophole. The movie generally relied on slapstick humor mixed with some over-the-top gay jokes, profuse use of the F slur, and a weird yellowface scene by Rob Schneider. For the modern queer audience, the moments they laughed and the reasons they laughed were different from the original jokes intended to be enjoyed in the movie, because those original jokes were no longer being experienced by the original audience that was meant to enjoy it, but it had found a new meaning with a new group who can enjoy the movie on the ironic grounds of othering it, making it anew in comedic terms. But they also, rightfully at times, were disappointed by the cheap homophobic jokes being made in a movie from the 2000s, which had a different understanding for humor related to mainstream homosexuality and gay allyship. You could tell the movie was generally well-intentioned and was made for a general audience who would watch an Adam Sandler movie back in the 2000s. So it didn't necessarily reach the standards of the 2020s. But for the modern audience who had a better understanding and experience with the gay community, the things which once looked natural in the 2000s to assume about gay people now looked strangely mechanical, and the things which once were mechanical now looked a little all too real when viewed on screen. But it's fair to say that it won't be long before our current comedic era has come and gone, where we'll all be looking at old TikToks thinking about how you can never make that today because our understanding and our experience will have changed yet again. But the homophobia at times present in I Now Pronounce You Chuck and Larry brings up a pretty well discussed topic of modern comedy as well. Is laughter moral? This was one of Bergson's main points in writing his address to laughter, which was whether laughter was a moral indicator. You know, basically, if you laugh at something morally wrong, is that a bad thing? The obvious answer is no. We could point out that we laugh because of a moral inconsistency being present in a circumstance, and morality is generally about, you know, something which is right or wrong ethically in a reductive way. While exposing a possible logical inconsistency is not necessarily about being ethically right or wrong, even though it could be, it's not necessarily always about that. Meaning, you can make a joke about a morally dubious topic, and someone laughing is not necessarily in moral support of the actual topic at hand. It just means they understand the logical inconsistency being presented in the joke, possibly. But it's also important to remember that Bergson points out that laughter is an emotionally distancing process from a scenario. So it does suggest that you have taken some kind of emotional distance from what could be a possibly morally dubious topic.
Hello, mate, what's your name? Oh, fucking hell, I picked on a deaf guy. And you signed back to me like I was gonna fucking understand sign language. But I don't understand sign language.
Which is a slightly more complex issue, especially with topics that are still possibly under conflicting understandings within society. You can say it's just a joke for, let's say, a joke that covers a topic like racism, but for other people who might have experienced racism, it's maybe different because it's not just a joke, it's a reality to them. You need to understand how the joke has to interact with the social meaning and environment it lives within. But why then are some topics so controversial and some topics free ground for joke telling? I'm going to go one step further than Bergson here, again, and suggest why that's the case. Because I think it all comes down to sacred objects and cursed objects. Like we were talking about before, a joke will attempt to expose a new meaning to an object we as a group have a certain pre-existing understanding of. Doing so by building the tension between the assumed natural meaning getting exposed to actually being a mechanical understanding. Well, for certain groups, there are meanings we attach to objects which are viewed as so untouchable, they either become sacred or cursed. In the case of the sacred, the meaning of the object is so important to us that it gets viewed as unimpeachable, which means an attempt to deconstruct this meaning through a joke is to mock the very understanding of the object we have such a strong connection to. For religious people, it's blaspheming against God. For royalty, it's making fun of the Queen. For woke people, it's making fun of the oppressed. Alternatively, we have cursed understandings of objects, which would hold such a negative meaning that to make a joke about the subject is equally as grave for a certain group, because you're, again, trying to change the meaning of that object. It's like making a joke about genocide. In making the joke, you risk losing some of the significance of the understanding we have about such a horrible topic. And just like comedy itself, these sacred and cursed objects will change over time for groups as their social understanding changes. Like maybe making fun of the Queen 400 years ago would get your head chopped off, but doing it now barely elicits a reaction, especially because she's dead. And over different periods, we end up having more or less things we feel comfortable about making jokes about, because we end up holding some things more taboo at some times than other times. But having said all this, we shouldn't pretend that stand-up comedians touching on taboo subjects doesn't give us a kind of transgressive pleasure in addressing those topics. Especially whenever they're topics which we might all be thinking but feel like we shouldn't culturally say out in the open. Sometimes it's good to interact with our social norms and give them a poke to see if they hold up to resistance. But of course, it's also worth pointing out that some stand-up comedians will go over the line from just, poking a transgressive topic to basically just all-out aggression. So the question so much isn't, is it moral to laugh at a joke? The question is more so, are you happy deconstructing the meaning someone might have with that topic they hold sacred or cursed? Because presumably, if it means so much to them, it must mean that they have experience with that subject that gives them reason to be uptight about it. For them, it might be really difficult to flatten out that experience and distance themselves from their emotions attached to a topic held so dear. I think it's especially important around jokes where your group might be laughing at an understanding you might have of a different group, which is actually a possible misrepresentation of that group. Because there's a chance that your understanding of a different group is premised on a misunderstanding of their experience. So maybe the joke isn't so much that the laughing is inherently bad, but that the joke is based on an understanding which is untrue or harmful. My intention here isn't to be the joke police, nor say someone should get cancelled or whatever like that. I'm just trying to kind of explain, I think, the dynamics that are going on within comedy here. Because I think we are kind of moving in an interesting way with where comedy's at right now. We've just come out of a period where everything seemed so taboo, everything seemed so either sacred or cursed, and it feels like right now we're kind of moving into a space where maybe not that much is being held taboo, or not that much is cursed, and we're all just kind of watching the dialectic of comedy change. And that's kind of the final thing I want to talk about. What the fuck is happening to comedy right now?
You can drain their energy via social media without having to even be near them.
That is racist.
You're correct.
It is.
Oh, yeah. 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 Oh, they hate me.
It's surprisingly simple to get total strangers completely furious with you.
They should get a life.
Bergson makes a point about the difference between art and comedy, which holds an interesting dichotomy in our modern digital setting. Bergson suggests that the emotional distance we take through comedy is actually flipped in the case of art. So in art, we actually become closer to someone else's emotions and understand their experience better through their portrayal of their understanding. We get to go beyond our own experience, or even see some part of our own experience within someone else. I don't think comedy is unable to do this, as there are jokes and comedians who've done very well to bring people together by using comedy, but I'm not sure that's always the case with online humor. I think possibly more than ever, we are saturated in a particular kind of comedy in almost every digital format. The same way television allowed for people to watch the same jokes on a weekly sitcom and talk about it around the water cooler on Monday, the internet has become a place where we all can find a space of shared understanding and find memes directly related to our group's understandings. But I do think there's an issue with this online group experience. It all takes place over the distance format of profiles rather than individuals, and these profiles have generally been free of tone, expression, or just general nuance. They have been representations of ourselves which have only been able to present limited ideas, images, and circumstances. Facebook was a place where you literally just used to write down, your jokes amongst your friends on a post, and maybe followed a few fan pages to share memes. Then you had Instagram and Twitter, where your profile became a little more developed and manicured, assuming you would be viewed by a larger audience, and also meaning you now got jokes from all corners of the internet. And obviously, even just with those sites, we're assuming you're not going below the surface level of the internet and looking at places like 4chan, where meme culture was truly developing, and people were even starting to use profiles where they specifically imitated other individuals to trick people for comedic effect, trolling. And as the sites we used developed, our profiles started to develop with them, but the profile remained this kind of barrier between ourselves and the actual internet interactions we were having. Our experience was always taken at a certain logical distance from our screens. I think the internet has become a space for what I'm going to term as the hyper-comedic, this accelerated form of comedy in our communications. Every interaction we have online through profiles is provided with a certain logical distance of the comedic, as we're able to flatten the experience of other groups and individuals to just the flat screen representation we see before us, along with the fact that our profiles have become more and more manicured, which allows for them to look more and more mechanical to the outside user. Online, every profile is the target for a potential joke. Add to that, we use the same understandings of others in our siloed communities. We can very easily flatten the natural experience of other individuals or other groups into the merely mechanical representation of their profiles. Everyone takes the shape of the stereotype, whether it be the liberal, the incel, or the crazy commie. Everything can become exposed for its possible logical inconsistency rather than taking on the actual experience of the other. The internet doesn't further connect us, it flattens us out. And here I want to add the internet's continuous irony stacking aspect of the hypercomedic. In an environment where you feel continuously insecure about being exposed, irony becomes the mask which can protect from the dangers of exposing your natural authenticity. And the more layers of irony you add on, the less and less likely you are to be exposed, because people can no longer even tell what meaning or understanding is natural or mechanical. It's the core of the troll who weaponizes the mechanical nature of the profile for comedy. There will be no certainty about where the mechanical profile begins and where the natural individual ends. And I want to add one more piece to this hypercomedic online environment, because I think we're dealing with also the overproduction of the meme. Memes may have started off as these funny images on Facebook with top-bottom text, but meme culture has developed beyond recognition from that. Memes have expanded in format and the variety of places you find them. Every group, every social media site, every person has curated memes fed to them daily. The internet has become a ravenous mass, with users waiting for the new meme format to scroll past on their phone, momentarily expending air from their nostrils and moving on looking for another small dopamine hit. This at its core is driven by the attention economy of tech companies who need you to continue to provide them with your time and data to then further provide you with more and more addictive content. It means the lifespan of the meme has shortened significantly as things have sped up, and that need for a new meme has continued to grow and grow. The singular object of a particular meme will be exploited for every possible meaning that it can inherit quicker and quicker. First, the object becomes a meme, then the object moves into subgroups memes who reinterpret the meaning for their own understandings. Then finally, the object becomes the subject of the meta meme, in which the format of the object itself becomes the joke, because all possible other meanings have been stripped away from it. And the only thing that you can actually make a joke about now is the meme object itself, exposing its lack of meaning. Each part of this hyper-comedic internet is representative of the distance we take from each other as we interact with it. We associate through profiles whose experience is inherently distant from each other. We use fake profiles to replicate the experience and understanding of others for our own enjoyment, and we also overproduce these memes until the objects connected to the meme lack all possible meaning. It's kind of unsurprising we often feel so disconnected online. And look, it's also fair to say that the digital age has given us a lot comedically. There have been a lot of people who've got famous off of this who probably wouldn't have otherwise. There's a lot of great jokes that have been made in memes and other formats online, which I'm very happy about. There's a lot of people who I watch who I don't think I would ever have seen without the internet. And I do think there still is comedy out there, even today, which works to bring people together rather than push us apart. But it's worth thinking about how some of the negative aspects of the internet have affected the way that we interact with each other, especially in a comedic sense, and how that maybe has affected our very serious politics. Sidetracking from Bergson for a moment, Slavoj Žižek, in his work The Sublime Object of Ideology, points out that laughter takes an ironic distance from its target and actually provides it with a lack of seriousness. So it doesn't just change the actual meaning of the object, but it makes it unserious. Laugh at the rich, but don't take their position seriously. Laugh at the police, but don't take their violence seriously. Laugh at the government, but don't take their control seriously. Even once he got elected, Trump's whole political brand as a president was weaponizing the unseriousness of the joke. The Trumpian jokes deconstructed any actual political meaning from the conversation. This unserious nature came about in a time when liberals had dominated the political comedy scene, and we're seeing the growth of a mainstream online culture, which made a lot of topics sacred, which could not joke about things in a generally altruistic attempt to protect the experience of others. But it was Trump and nearly every populist political leader like Johnson, Wilders, Orban, who stood in contrast to this. They used the right-wing deconstructive jokes while masking their worrying statements with layers of irony, leaving you guessing about their actual meaning. They could make wild promises, which sounded almost hilarious, but it didn't matter because it came with the unseriousness of the image attached to it. The opposition to this has been politicians like Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, these prototypical neoliberal politicians who couldn't quite seem to compete with Trump because the neoliberal facade is the perfect target for a joke, as TV comedians have been doing so for years with Clinton and Bush and Obama. But with Trump, the comedian was now on the stage with the neoliberal politician and debating them. Add to that, we live in a digitally confusing time where we can barely interpret the natural from the mechanical, and we have a traditional news media who were using an obsolete language and format, which left everyone disconnected and lacking trust in their reporting. Maybe it was unsurprising we also saw the rise of the comedian as not only a satirist, but as actual political commentators, because we felt they did actually represent some kind of natural authenticity in comparison to the mechanical movements of the newsreaders. Those newsreaders for like CNN and Fox News, who always played under a pretense of unbiased reporting, was often exposed in the modern age as a mechanical veneer to their natural ideological positions. Which brings me to my final point. I get why we are feeling this need for a little bit of emotional distancing at a time like this, which comedy is very good at providing. We feel like the world is going to shit. Everything is already meaningless and confusing. So our contemporary humor ends up mirroring that sense of meaninglessness by turning everything into a joke, protecting us from having to deal with the pretty worrying reality, which might drive us insane if we were to actually take it empathetically seriously at all times. But it also means that we have kind of removed any space for serious discussion with each other when everybody outside of our group is taken as an unserious joke, we end up where we are now without a real place for actual serious discussion. That kind of serious discussion which we need for us to kind of get to any serious actual actions or resolutions to our problems. So it's not like comedy is the root to our current issues, but I don't think it's helping either.